Hello, this is Edith Neumeyer, and I am the author of the book, The Mystery of Adam. I want to talk today about the Abomination of Desolation today, again. And I know I have done videos about it in the past, but I came across Mark 13 yesterday. And Mark 13 is really talked about the least of all three Gospels where this abomination of desolation is mentioned. The main person that is mentioned is Matthew 24 when people talk about the abomination of desolation. And Matthew is probably the hardest and the most confusing, the hardest to understand and the most confusing. So I have mentioned lots of times Luke 21, which is a lot easier to understand, specifically because this abomination is very related to the destruction of the temple. But I came across Mark 13, and I was, of course, aware of Mark 13, but I usually don't use it. And yet, he is very chronological, or more chronological than Matthew, and less confusing, and more like Luke. So Luke and Mark are actually very compatible. So if you don't believe Luke 21 about this abomination of desolation, then you know what? You have another witness that tells you exactly the same thing. Now, what am I talking about, this abomination of desolation? Now, we know that Daniel mentioned this abomination of desolation. And let me look here. I need to look at, of course, Mark 13 there, and it's in Mark 13:11. There it is, 14, and that's in Mark 13:14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, okay, should not be. So we're gonna look up verses in Daniel, because in other places Jesus said, refer to Daniel about this event. Now you can look that up in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21. In one of these, Jesus is specifically referring to that. I guess Mark left it out. Okay, he didn't say when you see the abomination of desolation according to Daniel. So where can you find the abomination of desolation in Daniel? We're going to have to go to, it's in Daniel 9:27. And I'm not going to go there today. Also in Daniel 11:31 and in 12:11. Daniel 12:11. Now, each time you read these in Daniel, be careful when you place them, especially Daniel 12:11. In Daniel 12:11, this phrase, if you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, is at the end. Actually, Daniel is not chronological in order, because there's the whole 11 and until this 12:11, it was kind of chronological, because it showed the progression all the way to the end until the 1,000-year reign starts. But then he goes back. He's almost like he's jumping back in time again to this abomination of desolation, which he has talked about in Daniel 11:31. Okay, so in Daniel 11:31, which is in progression, time progression. Okay, it is progression. He has it in there within the regular time. I hope you understand that. So in Daniel 11, everything is chronological. So the chapter is chronological, okay? But then when we get to 12, he continues the chronological order. But then at the end, when the 1,000-year reign starts, he goes back and again rehashes this abomination of desolation. Okay, I hope you understand that, because if you don't understand that, then people can come in and confuse you. And I'm not going to do a study right now on Daniel. I want to really focus on Mark 13, because Mark 13 makes it very obvious. See, with Daniel, we don't understand really well what this abomination of desolation is. Saying standing in the holy place. Of course, it has to be in the temple, right? But when we read this in connection with what Jesus prophesied, okay, then we understand what Daniel's abomination of desolation is. Okay, no place did Daniel say that there is going to be even the second temple rebuilt. Okay, or I don't know, he may have said that they will rebuild it, but never a third temple, never. Okay, so the temple that was destroyed, when we see the gospel, it's very obvious. Jesus said the destruction of the temple that Daniel talked about with this abomination of desolation is very much the destruction of the second temple and what happened in 70 AD. Okay? Now, you can do some advanced studies in Daniel. Read Daniel again, and I put down, those verses in Daniel. I'm going to put them on the bottom in my comment section or description section. So again, it's in Daniel now 9:27, which is in connection to the 70 weeks of Daniel. And then Daniel 11:31 is about the historical progression from Darius the Mede all the way to the end when the 1,000-year reign is established, the millennium is established. Okay. Then in verse 12, this timeline is finished, and then he goes back again and reminds them again about this abomination of desolation, because that is so important. So now let's go back to Mark. Okay, let's go back to Mark. Why do I say that this abomination of desolation is referring to the destruction of the second temple? You're going to have to read the whole chapter. You cannot start in the middle of a chapter and decide, whoa, that's what it's about. Okay? You cannot do that. So many people just pull out a section and just blabber on, okay? And tell you bunches of lies. Okay, you can't do that. See, and again, when somebody tells you about Daniel's 70 weeks and it's not fulfilled, it's all a lie, people. It's all a lie. Okay, because somebody wants you to believe there's 7 weeks. There's 7 weeks left at the end. Or there's not 7 weeks. There's a week left at the end. Sorry. There's this week left at the end. Okay? And that there's going to have to be a third temple built. And that in this third temple, there's going to be the Antichrist sitting in there. That is all lies. And one of these lies, again, I'm going to look at today. Now, I know my viewers, if you have listened to me on this topic, I just want to give you maybe a further proof. And, I read this Mark 13 last night, and I'm thinking, well, there we go again. Why are people not getting it? It just, I don't understand it. Well, let's again start with Mark 13. What is Mark talking about in chapter 13? Now remember that the original Gospel of Mark did not have chapters. So it just was a letter, no chapters, no verses. So, but we still going to have to find out, what did Jesus talk about here? Now, this is what Jesus actually talked about. Okay, this is what Jesus said. So what did Jesus talk about, and what why did he say it? So let's start with 13. Okay, 13 starts, verse 1. And as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Okay, where were they? In the temple. Which temple? Of course, not the third temple, right? It's the second temple. Okay, make no mistake. Okay, please. I know this is the second temple during Jesus' time. And Jesus was there, his disciples was there. And one of the disciples said, oh, wow, this is beautiful. Okay, so what did Jesus say in verse 2? And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Okay, when did this happen? Okay, when did this happen? This happened in 70 AD. The temple was destroyed and burned. Actually, first and if you can read, actually you can read that in Josephus, which is a historian, a Jewish historian that actually was on the side. I mean, he was on the side of the Jews, of course. He was a Jew, but he was very much supporting the emperor and Titus, who had the city destroyed. He was at the time not the emperor at that time, but he was very much on the side of the emperor as well, because he didn't want the temple to be destroyed. He didn't want the sacrifice to stop. He was trying to actually stop the Jews who were demolishing the Temple Mount. Okay, so if you read that, it's a very interesting story, and I have done some research on that and showed videos and talked about exactly that subject. So this is talking about also today. Okay, there is not one stone on top of each other today. Now, when people say, oh, the Temple Mount today, okay, and the wall, that was the Wailing Wall that's supposed to be left, that is not the temple. That's not where the temple stood. The Temple Mount today is Fort Antonia, which was the Roman fortress, which was right next to the temple, the temple, okay? But the temple was utterly destroyed. There was nothing left on top of each other, exactly like Jesus prophesied. So that's why it's very hard to even find the spot where the temple was, because there's no evidence, nothing left, none of the stones, okay? Again, we only have Fort Antonia, and sorry, I mean, that's the closest the Jews have where they can worship, but that wall, that Wailing Wall, is not part of the temple at all. The Fort Antonia is, the Temple Mount is Fort Antonia. Matter of fact, where the mosque is, the Dome of the Rock Mosque, is actually where a temple of one of the Roman gods stood. So just that in addition. But let's go back to Mark. So he says, not one stone will be on top of the other. And as he was sitting on the Mount Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John, Andrew were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? What are they asking? They're asking, when will this happen? When will this destruction happen? Okay, that's what they were asking him. Now, why was Matthew the only one who mixed it, who brought in the end time, the understanding of the question about the end times? Why? Why did not Luke bring it in? Okay, and Luke was very methodical writer. Was a very methodical writer. Okay, why did Matthew bring it in and not Luke? Well, I have the feeling, because we have two witnesses here, Mark and Luke, and of course Matthew is actually an eyewitness of the whole thing, right? But Mark and Luke really were not. Well, Mark could have been. Mark is actually he was not one of the disciples, but he could have been there as a young boy, okay, because I think he was the cousin of Barnabas. I don't know if Barnabas was even a disciple. But Mark was a very young boy at the time. He may have been, running along with Jesus and heard him. But most likely what people say is what Mark wrote down is the account of Peter. Okay, Peter and Mark were really close. And so they believe that Mark wrote down what Peter told him. I'm not 100% sure about that one. But anyways, going back, why is Mark and Luke the same and does not bring end times prophecy? Okay, because see what Matthew did is he thought when the temple's destruction is when Christ returns, and that is when the end is. But they just didn't know. Okay, they didn't know. They didn't see the whole full picture. They didn't see the full picture. And so Matthew may have added this end time stuff with everything, which Mark later on does. But here specifically, the thing was about the destruction of the temple, and the disciples ask him, when will this destruction happen? And Jesus began to say to them, see to it that no one misleads you. Now, is he talking about the destruction of the temple? Yes. So he is talking to the disciples right there and saying, make sure nobody misleads you. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will mislead many. He is talking to the disciples. So there's going to be people that will mislead the disciples. Okay? False messiahs. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Now, what end is he talking about? He's talking about the end of the temple, the destruction of the temple. Okay? For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be also famines. These things merely are the beginning of birth pangs. They had earthquakes there during that time between Christ's death and the destruction of the temple. That's 30 years, 35 years. Earthquakes. They had wars. They had numerous wars. The Jews were in war with the Romans, okay, for a long time. They were pestilences. They had famines during that time. Matter of fact, the Jews died. It was so bad in Jerusalem because they didn't have any food, okay? So yes, all these things did happen before the destruction of the temple. Read Josephus again. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues. That happened then because the synagogues were still there. And you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them. This happened to the disciples. Okay? And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. Now, this is what Jesus told the disciples and the apostles. You have to preach the gospel to all nations. Okay? The gospel needs to be preached to everybody. And when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not be anxious beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. He is talking specifically to the disciples. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Make no mistake, this is not about the end times. This is not about the tribulation at the end times. Yes, this also happened to the Christian believers later on. But he is talking about specifically to the disciples what's going to happen to the disciples here. And brother will deliver brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. Again, this happened during the disciples' time. And of course, later on too. I'm not denying that, but this is what he's telling them, and we're not finished. Okay? And you will be hated by all on account of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. Now, we're going to verse 14. Nothing has been said at this point about the end times, the times we're living in right now. Okay? A possible tribulation. Nothing. This is nothing about a tribulation. This is still about the times before the destruction of the temple. What happened during those 35 years or 40 years before the destruction of the temple, between the time of the destruction of the temple and Jesus' death. Okay? Make no mistake. Now, 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. What are you supposed to be understanding? This is about Daniel's prophecy. Okay? This is about Daniel's prophecy. Understand, reader. Okay? Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is not about today during a tribulation. Okay? This is not about anybody fleeing from Judea to the mountains. It's not about us fleeing to the mountains because we see the tribulation or the Antichrist coming out. That is all bunches of false interpretations and are misleading the believers because they don't know the scripture. Okay? Well, let's continue, people. And let him who is on the housetop not go down to enter in to get anything out of the house, and let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are with child and those who are nurse babes in those days. But pray that it may not happen in winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation such has not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God had created until now and never shall. So it will be terrible tribulation. But that is not at the end time. It was their tribulation. Okay? Tribulation started when Jesus died and the church was founded. Tribulation started with the first disciples. We just read it. They were taken to the synagogues. They were flogged. They were even killed. Okay? For their names. This is all still during the time before the destruction of the temple. Okay? So unless the Lord has shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. Okay? The elect. And when anyone says to you, behold, there is the Christ, or behold, there he is, do not believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to mislead the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. Okay? So, yes, there will be tribulation. And I'm going to continue to read right here because then we go into this really interesting transition. Now he is talking about 24. But in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Okay? This has not happened. This is going to be the start of the wrath of God. Okay? So there is now a 2,000-year difference because the tribulation continues. Okay? The tribulation continued because that's why he's saying, but in those days after the tribulation. What tribulation is he talking about? He's talking about the tribulation the saints have been going through for 2,000 years. After that, this now 24 starts a new, totally new section. There's actually 2,000 years in between people. And then the wrath of God comes. But this section right here is specifically talking about the destruction of the temple. And during the destruction of the temple, the first Christians in Jerusalem were warned. This was their warning. And they left. When they saw the destruction, they left. And they were saved. So we know, for instance, that Peter ended up in Rome, so he wasn't killed. We know that John ended up in Ephesus with Mary. They were not killed. So we know that the Christians, the church of Jerusalem, got out. They were not killed. There was hardly anybody surviving the bloodbath after the Roman got done. Okay? The Roman didn't even start destroying the temple. Okay? It was the Jews themselves. Read Josephus. It's really horrible. It's horrible. It was the Jews' fault that Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. It was the Jews' fault. Okay? Not the Romans. The Romans would have never, ever, done this. They had no interest in destroying the temple. Matter of fact, Titus wanted to save the temple, and he couldn't. But the Roman soldiers just finally had enough because they kept attacking them. They were attacking Fort Antonia, and they couldn't stop it. So they destroyed the whole city. The young people, the people that were still kind of, were good workable people, they took them as slaves into captivity. But most people were killed. Most people were killed in Jerusalem, and everything was destroyed. I mean, absolute destruction. Just like Jesus prophesied it here in 13:2. 13:2, he prophesied it. And everything that you read from 13:1 to 13:23 is exactly about that destruction. Make no mistake. And Mark is so extremely clear. So is Luke 21. The only one who is not 100% clear is Matthew, because he brought in this little phrase in the signs of the end. Okay? In the signs of the end. But he was not talking about the end times, because Matthew and the disciples, I don't even think Mark or Luke saw it. They didn't see. They thought Jesus would return during their lifetime. Paul thought so. Okay? They all thought Jesus would return to during their lifetime, and he didn't. He did not. They didn't see that it would take 2,000 years for him to return. Okay? We are now 2,000 years down the road. And what will happen next is the rapture. Again, this word, of course, is not in the Bible, but the taken out of the church, the saints, that is in the Bible. Okay? Make no mistake, it's in the Bible. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It is there. Even in the Old Testament, I have shown a verse in Isaiah 26, 19 through 21. Okay? Where that is the case. So, again, read Mark 13 to verse 23 and think about it. Okay? Think about it. Abomination of desolation. Let me talk just a little bit about that. Abomination of desolation. Desolation means destruction. Okay? Abomination of desolation, of destruction. That's what happened with the temple. The temple was destroyed, and that was a desolation. That was an abomination. Okay? That the temple was treated the way it was. Okay? And the Jews started it. Okay? The Jews actually caused the fire that was burning the Temple Mount. But it's not when somebody sits in the temple and desecrates the temple. That's not what it is. Okay? It is it's a desolation, a destruction, a devastation. Okay, that's what desolation is. I have done actually a study on this word, abomination of desolation, and maybe you should be doing that yourself. Has nothing to do with somebody desecrating the temple and sitting in it, like most of these false teachers are trying to tell you. People, wake up. People, wake up. If this is not helpful, leave some questions and comments on the bottom. And again, remember, third temple is not biblical. Nobody in the Bible are we hearing that there's going to be a third temple. Even if we hear it, God has not commanded it to anybody. There's not one prophet that has commanded that the third temple needs to be rebuilt. None. Not even the Old Testament prophets. They never said, it has to be rebuilt. Or the New Testament prophets. Nobody said the temple has to be rebuilt. We know who the temple is. We know that right now the true temple is being built. Okay? Remember that. No temple is necessary. And if somebody sets themselves into this true temple that is being built right now, then this third temple is not necessary. And that is exactly what Paul was talking about. He was talking about that somebody is going to sit in the real temple of God. Okay? That's what he is saying. Not the third temple. But I'm coming to an end. Read those verses and let the Holy Spirit guide you.